Welcome to the Sound of Ideas from IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Stephanie Haney. Thank you for being with us here on your Monday, December 15th. Now, as we wrap up 2025 and look ahead to 2026, politically, a major race on Ohio ballots next year will be for Ohio governor. The Ohio Republican Party has already endorsed one candidate, Vivek Ramaswamy, well ahead of the party's primary elections, which will be held in May. That's when the Republican and Democratic candidates for governor will be officially decided. But with the endorsement of President Donald Trump, Ramaswamy has emerged as the main GOP contender. Now, last month, I spoke with the Democratic frontrunner, Dr. Amy Acton, which you can find a link to that conversation on today's show page at ideastream.org/SOI. Today, we'll be bringing you my conversation, which was previously recorded with Vivek Ramaswamy. We talked last week. We had an exclusive interview covering his priorities if elected, his message to people concerned about health insurance premiums going up, and what he learned from voters on his 88-county tour in Ohio. Now, since this interview was pre-recorded, we can't take your calls, but you are always welcome to email us your thoughts. You can send those to soi@ideastream.org, or you can send us a message on Instagram at The Sound of Ideas, and we'll include those comments in tomorrow's show. And now here's my conversation with Republican candidate for Ohio Governor, Vivek Ramaswamy. Now, candidate Ramaswamy, you have talked about your takeaways from the November election for the Republican Party, and you said two things. You said that Republicans need to focus on affordability and that they need to cut out identity politics. So how are you putting that into action in your campaign for governor for Ohio?
Well, the truth is, Stephanie, those are exactly the core pillars of what I'm running on, is reviving the American dream in our state. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. My parents grew up with not much, right? They traveled halfway around the world as legal immigrants. I went to public schools through 8th grade. But I've lived the American dream because of the education and the opportunities that I got in this state. And I'm in this to pass that same American dream on to our kids. Now, in order to do that, we need to put more money in the pockets of Ohioans, and we need to do it now. You know, think about property tax relief. We're delivering that immediately, putting our state on a path in the long run to zero income taxation as well, so Ohioans can keep what they earn, but also bring down those electric bills, which have gone up 50, 60, 70% in many parts of Northeast Ohio this year over last year. We've got to produce more energy. So the essence of my campaign is focused not on necessarily what the national issues of the day are or the traditional Republican versus Democrat divides nationally. It's focused on what puts money in the pockets of Ohioans today, here and now, and to give our kids the opportunities to give them a good education so they can get a good job and not only afford the American dream, but thrive in this state by living the American dream. That's why I'm in this.
Let's talk about affordability for a moment here. A recent article in Forbes magazine estimated your assets to be worth about $1.8 billion, which is almost double what it was last year. I think those numbers are pretty close to tracking. A spokesperson from your team was quoted saying that that seemed roughly right. Now, your competitor, Dr. Amy Acton, on the Democratic side, she says that you don't have a concept of affordability because of your wealth. So how can you relate to Ohioans who are trying to decide whether to pay rent or buy groceries?
Well, the truth is I wasn't born with the silver spoon. My parents grew up in raised us in a humble background in Evendale, Ohio. The idea of attending public schools was a non-factor. We couldn't even consider affording that. I went to public schools through 8th grade, but I watched my parents work hard. My dad worked at GE for his entire life. My mom was a geriatric psychiatrist who took care of patients in the VA, worked in nursing homes in Southwest Ohio, and worked hard to give my brother and I a great education, which is the foundation. And that informs my view. Now I've gone on, thankfully, to found successful companies. And I believe that success is something that we should celebrate rather than villainize. Part of the way that I generated that wealth was by developing medicines for patients who needed them. One of the medicines that I oversaw was actually a life-saving therapy for kids with a congenital disease where 100% of those kids die by the age of 3 if they're untreated. And I'm proud to say my company developed a drug that is now FDA approved that allows those kids to live lives of a normal duration. We also addressed women's health conditions like endometriosis and uterine fibroids that the rest of the pharma industry had ignored. That's how you succeed in American capitalism. That's how you succeed in this country. And what I want for our state is I want every kid growing up in Ohio to have those same opportunities that I did. Is that available to kids growing up in the inner city of Cleveland or even in the inner city of Cincinnati? Not right now, they're not. When the inner city schools were closed during the COVID-19 pandemic for a year and a half, while private schools actually remained open. See, by the time I got to high school, I went to a private school. That school was closed for 5 days during the pandemic, while inner city schools were closed for over a year and a half. So one of the things I've noticed, Stephanie, is many of those who preach about inequality actually enact the policies that create the very inequality they complain about. But I'm in this to deliver solutions. And so I'm passionate to make sure that every kid who grows up with humble beginnings or middle class beginnings, as I did, is able to achieve even bigger things than I did in this state. And I don't think an ordinary politician is going to be able to deliver that. I do think it's going to be somebody who has that business experience to grow our economy, to understand what it takes to bring high-paying jobs back to our state. That is why I'm in this. I never grew up believing that I wanted to be a governor of a state. I'm not a politician, but I'm doing this because I want to give back to the state that allowed me to have these opportunities, and that motivates me.
One thing I do want to point out, because I do think it is an important distinction to make, is the schools weren't completely closed. They were operating remotely for that time, those inner city schools.
I mean, physically closed. The school buildings were physically closed. And the distinction that I draw is private schools were physically open. And there's a major difference now in the trajectory of kids who were sitting at home, supposedly learning on Zoom where there's no ability to track attendance in the same way, versus the kids in those private schools. That is a disparity where those kids in our public schools, those kids in Cleveland public schools, will never get that year and a half of their education back. Now, we can't change the past, and I'm not in this to play a blame game. But what I do want to do is learn from some of the mistakes of the past to make sure we're doing better for the future. And to your point, how can somebody like me relate? Well, I was one of those kids growing up in public schools for the first 8 years of my life in Evendale, Ohio. And I understand what it takes to achieve that American dream, starting with that foundation of education. I also think some of the problems we face are tough. I mean, you think about reducing and identifying areas of government waste and putting that back in people's pockets. I don't think ordinary politicians who grew up as bureaucrats or career politicians are able to do that. I do think it's going to take somebody who has a business-minded, practical mentality to bring down those property taxes, to put money back in the pockets of Ohioans, to have the path to license and cut red tape, to be able to move more quickly as a government to produce more energy. That's how we bring down those electric bills. So to me, that's not about right versus left. This is about right versus wrong. This is about up versus down. And I'm choosing up for Ohio. And the fact that my own life trajectory has, thankfully in my 40 years, been upward, that's the same upward trajectory I want for every kid in this state.
Let's stay on the topic of private versus public school for just a minute.
Sure.
One of the big donors to the Victors Not Victims Political Action Committee, which is a supporter of your campaign, is Jeff Yass. He's of the Philadelphia area. I gave $10 million to that organization. And he's a major supporter of expanding government spending on private education. What would you like to see happen here in Ohio? You talked a bit about public education and the disparities between the two. What would you like to see happen with public education here in Ohio?
So look, I can't speak to anybody else's vision. I can tell you about mine. So what my perspective is that we need a combination of school choice with added accountability and standards for our public schools to compete with the best of those alternatives. I'll tell you what I mean. I do think that every parent deserves the right to be able to choose where they send their kids to school. It's actually a progressive policy. It's going to be kids who grow up in poor urban environments who benefit from that added choice. But there's also good data showing that private schools, when you have school choice in that same area, the public schools tend to perform better because they're held to higher accountable standards. Now, one of my core areas of focus, which is not a traditional Republican talking point, but is my core focus in educational reform, is bringing standards back to public schools themselves. I say this as somebody who was positively impacted by my own public school upbringing. I had a teacher named Ms. Kinney in 6th grade. Tragically, she passed a couple of years ago, but she changed my life. She saw potential in me that others didn't, and she lit a fire under my feet to be able to work harder and achieve the things I did. Ms. Hendel, my first grade teacher, came out to a recent campaign event and surprised me recently. So I care about rewarding our public school teachers and incentivizing them to actually be able to attract the best next generation into the profession. But we have to do it with standards. What does that mean? We used to have the 3rd grade reading guarantee in Ohio. It was a simple policy that said that if you're medically capable, you should be able to read by the end of 3rd grade. And as long as you're medically capable, you're not going to 4th grade until you can. I think that's common sense because that's the point in a child's life where they make that special transition from learning to read to reading to learn. And if they never make that transition, their chance of achieving success in life Stephanie falls like a rock off a cliff. But if you make that transition by third grade, by fourth grade, ideally earlier, but at least by the end of third grade, your chance of achieving financial independence, graduating from high school, getting a job, and thriving as an adult go through the roof. So those early interventions, those early programs that really empower our kids through standards in our public schools, that's what I'm bringing back. Some people find that controversial. The third grade reading guarantee is not without controversy. It's why they got rid of it. It's why it got repealed. But I want to bring back those kinds of standards, civic education in high school. Look, I personally believe that every high school senior who graduates from an Ohio public high school should have to pass the same civics test that every legal immigrant has to pass before the immigrant becomes a voting citizen. Because you have to know something about your country, to be proud of your country, to be a citizen of your country in the most informed sense. And so that's what I aim to do, is elevate the standards of performance at our public schools, do it by celebrating the power of our public school teachers and incentivizing them. Even I think the entry-level pay for public school teachers should actually be higher than the $40,000 a year entry-level salary that we have now. But it's going to take all of us aligning on the importance of education for our kids to actually get there.
You mentioned healthcare and access to different health treatments and how instrumental that was for you in your position today. What do you say to Ohioans who are looking at either losing health insurance altogether or having to pay much higher premiums if the Affordable Care Act premium tax credits aren't extended before the end of the year?
So look, obviously we need thoughtful health reform in this country. Healthcare is too unaffordable, and frankly, health outcomes aren't good compared to how much we actually spend on healthcare itself. We need to bring down those healthcare bills. And I think one of the ways to do it is to think about how we actually put money in the pockets of Ohioans. There's many ways to do that from a policy standpoint. Federally, health savings accounts have been discussed. There are many sensible ways to do this, but I think the ultimate solution, Stephanie, comes from putting money in the pockets of Ohioans and to make sure that we also have a competitive healthcare system as well. So I do have some ideas. Most of those are federal issues, right? So for our congressmen and our U.S. senators, that's an important area for them to focus on. My question is, what can I do from a state perspective to make everyday life more affordable? And I'm looking at bringing other ways of just putting money directly in the pockets of Ohioans, including through sensible healthcare measures that we'll be talking about over the course of the campaign. States can look at how we more effectively run Medicaid, about how we more effectively potentially consider strategies for bringing down prescription drug costs and either other healthcare expenses at a state level. I'm committed to that, but I also am very realistic about what I tell people we're going to do. What I say we're going to do in this campaign, we're going to deliver. Bringing down property taxes, bringing down those electric bills, bringing down the cost of housing by building more houses in our cities, cutting the income taxation burden over the long run. That puts money in the pockets of everyday Ohioans. And if we're able to supplement that with other ways that also allow them to actually afford their health care, think about those deductibles, think about those unexpected health expenses that in many cases, even private insurance isn't covering today. The best way we do that is by increasing the wealth and the health of Ohioans, and that's what I'm committed to.
Staying on the topic of public health for a moment,
Sure.
the latest data shows in Cuyahoga County, cocaine is now involved in more overdose deaths than opioids.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
What's your plan for helping Ohioans overcome substance abuse issues?
And I do think, Stephanie, that's the right way to look at this, is substance abuse issues overall, because we've seen opioids, fentanyl, cocaine, each taking their turn at the top. But the point is, why are especially a lot of young people turning to substance abuse and addiction in the first place? I think there's a deeper loss of conviction and purpose and meaning, especially amongst young people, a loss of conviction in their sense that they're able to work hard and get ahead. A lot of this starts in the schools. Think about the mental health epidemic. The earliest place for intervention is through prevention in our schools, understanding when someone's having a tough time, what does that actually look like? Bringing back, as I said, my mom was a psychiatrist, bringing back proper psychiatric care and alternatives so people don't turn to drug addiction. That's where I favor getting to the root causes. Sure, do we need to empower law enforcement in our cities to make sensible decisions that they're able to arrest violent criminals or arrest drug dealers? Absolutely. And I'm supportive of that, fully supportive of that. But that's not enough. We have to actually get to the root causes of mental health care and even mental health issues of prevention. And that's where I think our schools and frankly, even programs through supporting families can can play a much bigger role in our state. And that's where something I'm intensely focused on. My wife's a physician. She's a throat surgeon at Ohio State. And I hear from her all the time as well about the importance of early intervention and prevention. And that's something we're committed to both as a family as well as leaders of the state.
You mentioned they're arresting the people who are the offenders in these cases of the substance abuse here in Ohio. Now, given the increase in cocaine related deaths that we've seen, what do you say to Ohioans who are questioning President Donald Trump's pardoning of former Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was found to be responsible for bringing more than 400 tons of cocaine into the U.S.?
So look, I'm not paying attention to every pardon decision, nor am I in the room where those decisions are made. I'm focused on Ohio, okay? And I know that a lot of the national media, and even these days, even local media, wants to focus on national polarization. That's not where my focus is. A lot of the Democrats, even in the state, try to focus on issues that don't relate to Ohio. I have one mission in running for governor. How do we revive the American dream in Ohio? How do we put more money in the pockets of everyday hardworking Ohioans? And how do we give our kids the world-class education that I believe is the birthright of every kid born and raised in this state? That's where my laser focus is. A couple of years ago, I was more involved in national politics, but right now, I'm laser focused on what we can do to lift up the lives of Ohioans. And frankly, I think everything else, to me at least, as hopefully the next governor of the state, is a distraction.
Let's talk about polarization a bit here. I'm going to bring up a sensitive topic right now. Let's talk about the political activist Charlie Kirk just for a moment. And unfortunately was assassinated while speaking at Utah University just over 3 months ago. That was at an event organized by Turning Point USA, a conservative youth organization that he had founded. You had called Charlie one of your closest political friends in American politics. I want to say first, I'm very sorry for your loss of your friend.
It was more than my loss. It was a loss for our country.
Now, your competitor, Dr. Amy Acton from the Democratic side, she also got death threats during her time as the director of the Ohio Department of Health during the pandemic. So what do you think we need to do to bring down the temperature and stop political violence on all sides?
So look, I think the first thing is, as leaders, we have an obligation to state the obvious truth. Words are not violence. Violence is violence. And violence is never an acceptable response to words, period. Not in the United States of America. We're the country where, and even think about the Ohio that I grew up in, we would have neighbors, even friends, and even family members amongst our extended family, uncles, cousins, who would disagree vehemently at the dinner table, but we would still be at the dinner table at the end of it. That's the Ohio I grew up in. That's the America that I grew up in. And I will say in the social media driven era, in the algorithmic era, we have lost that sense of common cause and unity. It's not going to be through agreeing on every issue. That's never going to happen. Okay, even most spouses don't agree on everything. Most family members don't agree on everything. How can we expect to agree on everything with our fellow citizens in a republic of 330 million people? That's never going to happen. But the beauty of this country is we have the freedom to express ourselves without fear of violence. And I don't care what side it comes from, you will always hear me condemning political violence. Part of my job as a governor is to set that tone. And look, I would say that's the standard I'm aiming to hold myself to in this campaign. For people who have been following this campaign, you know, I'm not going to speak about my competitors, but I'll speak about the standards I hold myself to, is to say that we're focused on what lifts up Ohioans. And frankly, I want to make sure that anyone running against me is every bit as safe and secure in their ability to express their viewpoints as I hope that I am able to as well. That's America at our best. And I think that should be one basic principle that unites all of us, regardless of our party.
Something else that's on the national conversation, but also a very big conversation here in Ohio, is gerrymandering. A Newsweek article from 2024 reported Ohio is among the 11 worst offenders for gerrymandering in the country. There was a proposed constitutional amendment on the ballot here in 2024 that did not pass. The current governor, Mike DeWine, said that the legislature should be tackling gerrymandering reform in Ohio. What's your take on it here?
Look, I think we need common sense approaches here. At the end of the day, to say that Ohio is one of the worst states in this regard, when you have people from both parties who have at least endorsed the approach that we've taken, I think makes this a bit of a sideshow relative to the issues that Ohioans actually care about. I'm in this to bring down costs and put money in the pockets of Ohioans. That's what matters. And, you know, look, I think a lot of people in what I sometimes call the chattering class, right, the D.C. political consultant circles, want to talk about all kinds of issues that don't actually matter to one key stakeholder group called the voters. And to me, that's what actually matters. And at this point in time, it is true that a lot of people feel like costs have gone up faster than wages over the last half decade in our country. But we got to deliver solutions. And to me, we have practical ways to put money back in your pocket. I'm focused on property tax reform. How do you bring down those property taxes immediately? How do you bring down the income tax eventually down to zero so you keep what you earn? How do we make housing more affordable? How do we bring down those electric bills? And in total, those numbers add up. I want Ohioans, and they will be, I believe by the end of my first year as governor, objectively, meaningfully wealthier than they are today. And that also gives them the ability to give their kids the self-confidence to get a great education, to stay in the state rather than to move somewhere else. Those are the issues that I'm focused on. And I do think that one of the risks of being in politics is you have social media on one side, drives us in the direction of political polarization. You have a lot of the consultant class and the Washington, D.C. politico types that will distract you with D.C.-centric issues or political-centric issues rather than the actual issues that make life better for everyday Ohioans. The reason I chose this office to run for is that I believe I can make a change. As somebody who's run successful businesses, as somebody who's managed a P&L, as somebody who has had to sign not just the back of a paycheck, but the front of a paycheck, I understand how we're going to put more of those dollars, more of those paychecks in the pockets of Ohioans. That's what I'm focused on. And frankly, I think that's priority number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 for me before anything else matters.
Talking about those priorities as we wrap this up, this will be our last question here. You've been traveling around the state. You've been to all 88 counties. You've met the voters. You've met people out there. What are they telling you, and how is that informing what your priorities are if you were to be elected governor of Ohio?
And thank you, Stephanie. One of my priorities is indeed listening. I mean, that 88 county tour this year, in this calendar year since I launched, we have visited in person all 88 counties, I think most of them multiple times over. And one of the things I love is talking to people who you don't meet in the usual political circles that maybe politicians run in. That includes Republicans. It also includes Democrats. And one of the hallmark features, favorite parts of my campaign was occasionally we would even have protesters outside of our campaign. And I made it a point that whenever it was practical, whenever it was feasible, we did something that was a little unusual. We went out and talked to the protesters. There was one woman I met, I will never forget this story, in Wayne County, Ohio, in May of this year. She approached me. She was upset. She was an older woman. She said, "Why are you cutting our veterans' benefits?" And I was shocked because we have no plan to do any such thing. I said, "Where did you hear that?" She paused for a second. She said, "I don't know. I think I heard it somewhere." And that's a summary of everything I think that's wrong with modern social media and modern media. I told her, "No, we're not cutting your veterans' benefits, but why don't you do this? Why don't you come in and join us at this Republican-focused event? You're a protester here outside. See what you think." And I give her a lot of credit. She came in. Everyone else is wearing a suit and a tie or a beautiful dress. She's got a sweaty T-shirt on a hot Saturday late afternoon, and she comes in Wayne County, Ohio, joins me at the head table in a room of 700 people where I'm speaking. I go up on stage, I'm speaking, and I'm keeping an eye on her over the course of the speech. And I give her a lot of credit because it's awkward to be her. But we ask everyone in the room, it turns out she was a Vietnam War veteran. We ask everyone in the room who's a veteran to stand up that night. About 30 people stood up. The entire room applauded. She started to get emotional. We called her up on stage, and I gave her the mic and said, "You got 2 minutes? You came to here to be heard outside. We'll let you be heard inside this room tonight." You know what she said? By then, she turned to the audience and said, "You know what? You all have changed my perspective on Republicans tonight." And I thought that was progress. I don't know if she's going to vote for me or not, but that's the culture, the political culture I want to bring back to our state. The issues are clear. On both sides of the aisle, people want their property taxes down, and they want to bring down their property taxes in a way that doesn't harm education but helps education. I'm confident I'm going to be able to deliver on both prongs of that. That's something we hear in all 88 counties. On one hand, we bring standards back to public education. On the other hand, we have a clear and distinct plan to reset property taxes back to what they were before the spike that they've encountered in the last half decade. To be able to do that while also putting money in the pockets of Ohioans by bringing down those electric bills and those housing costs, produce more energy and build more homes. That's the formula. I think at this moment in time, one of the things that I do see is people are hungry for somebody who comes from outside of the bureaucracy, somebody who isn't a bureaucrat, who isn't a career politician, who's actually created something of value in the real world. And for me, I've been blessed by the opportunities this state and this country have given me and my family. I'm in this to make sure that every one of our kids in their generation are able to achieve even bigger things than I did by staying right here in the state. And we've seen, thankfully, to record crowds at every place we've gone, a huge amount of energy behind that message. And now it's going to be up to us to deliver.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this conversation. Candidate Ramaswamy, thank you very much for the time.
Thank you, Stephanie. Good to see you.
Again, that was my conversation with party-endorsed Republican candidate for Ohio Governor Vivek Ramaswamy. You can find my conversation with the major Democratic candidate, Dr. Amy Acton, on today's show page, ideastream.org/SOI. If you'd like to get the last word on any of today's topics, you can send us an email at soi@ideastream.org. You can also find us on Instagram. We're at The Sound of Ideas. On Thursday, we talked with leaders from the Cleveland Metropolitan School District about their consolidation plan, which was just officially approved by the school board last Tuesday. We also talked with a student who will have to change schools and the mother of 2 children with special needs who has concerns about what kind of attention her children will get when they have to move to a school with many more students. Regarding CMSD leadership saying consolidation is required due to a 50% drop over the past 25 years because of lower birth rates in enrollment, Stephen emailed in. A population turnaround to growth is not unfounded. This region is now considered one of the so-called climate havens, and Redfin has a new report naming the region as a hot real estate market for 2026. Thanks for sharing that with us, Stephen. We appreciate it. Tomorrow on The Sound of Ideas, we'll learn about different multicultural celebrations throughout the winter, like Kwanzaa, Hanukkah, and the Lunar New Year, to name a few. If you missed any part of today's show, you can listen to The Sound of Ideas wherever you get your podcasts, or you can watch the show on the IdeaStream Public Media YouTube page.